This is my true story. 20 years ago, everyone in my village thought I died in the flood. They held a funeral, cried at my empty grave, and moved on with their lives. But I didn't die that night. Last month, my family found me alive in a hospital 3 towns away. When they rushed in crying and calling me father, I said something that made their hearts freeze. But before I tell you what happened, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people. I spent my entire life building that farm from nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, because when I bought that land 42 years ago, it was just rocks and dry soil that nobody wanted. I cleared every single rock with my own 2 hands, and my back still aches from those years of bending and lifting and breaking my body so my sons would have something to inherit. I planted every tree on that property, and I remember each one because I dug those holes myself in the burning sun while my wife brought me water and told me to rest, but I couldn't rest because I had 4 young boys to feed and a future to build for them. I built our house brick by brick over 3 years, and I didn't hire anyone because we couldn't afford it, so I learned masonry from library books and made mistakes and fixed them and worked until my hands bled and my shoulders screamed, but I kept going because that's what fathers do. I taught my sons everything I knew about farming and about life, and I showed them how to plow straight lines, and how to read the soil, and how to respect the land that fed us. Every morning I woke them before sunrise, and we worked together as a family, and I thought those moments would bond us forever. I believed that farm would keep us together long after I was gone, and I imagined my sons raising their own children there and teaching them the same lessons I taught. I never asked them for gratitude or praise because seeing them grow strong and capable was enough reward for me. I gave them everything I had and everything I was, and I thought that meant something. I thought blood and sweat and sacrifice created loyalty, but I was wrong about that, and it took me 20 years of living like a homeless man to finally understand that some children only see their parents as obstacles to inheritance. I worked myself into an old man by 50, and my body started failing me, but I kept pushing because the farm needed me, and my sons were still young and learning. I never complained about the pain in my joints or the exhaustion that made me collapse into bed every night, because complaining felt like weakness, and I wanted my sons to see strength. I wanted them to respect hard work and dedication and family bonds. I poured every single day of my life into that land and into raising them right, and I actually believed it mattered to them. I thought they valued what we built together, but I was living in a fantasy that shattered completely on the night before the flood, when I stood outside my own window and heard the truth about what my sons really thought of me. 20 years ago, on the night before the flood, I was coming back from the barn after checking on a sick cow, and I heard loud voices coming from inside my house through the kitchen window. I stopped walking because something about their tone made my stomach turn, and I stood there in the dark, listening to my 4 sons argue about something. The eldest son said we should just wait until the old man finally dies, and then we split everything 4 ways, and it will be so much easier to sell. My second son laughed and said I was becoming a real burden now, because I could barely work anymore, and I ate too much food for someone who contributed so little. The third one said my death would solve all their problems because they could finally move to the city and live modern lives instead of being stuck on this miserable farm. The youngest one, who I thought loved me the most, said he was tired of pretending to care and that he wished I would just hurry up and die already so they could get their inheritance. They talked about me like I was already a corpse rotting in the ground, and they were just waiting for the formality of my actual death. They discussed which pieces of equipment they would sell first and how much money the land was worth and who would get the house. Nobody said anything about keeping the farm or honoring my memory or teaching their own children the skills I taught them. They just wanted me gone so they could cash out and forget I ever existed. I stood outside that window for 30 minutes listening to them plan my funeral like it was a business transaction. My heart broke into pieces that night, and I realized my 4 sons saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between them and money. They didn't love me, and maybe they never had, and I was just too blind to see it because I wanted so badly to believe family meant something. I walked away from that window, and I sat in the barn with tears running down my face, and I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. That was the night I decided that if they wanted me dead so badly, then I would give them exactly what they wished for. That same night, around 2 in the morning, the river broke through its banks, and water started pouring into our village like God himself had opened a dam. People were screaming and running and banging on doors to wake their neighbors, and the sound of rushing water was louder than anything I had ever heard in my life. My sons ran out of the house yelling for me to come quickly and to grab whatever I could carry, but I just stood there in the barn watching them panic. They were calling my name and searching for me with flashlights, and I could hear the fear in their voices, but it wasn't fear for me, it was fear of losing their inheritance before they could claim it. I made a decision right there in that moment, while the water was rising around my ankles. I decided I would not go back to that house, and I would not let them find me, because if they wanted me dead, then I would disappear and let them think the flood took me. I walked away from my farm in the opposite direction, while everyone else was running toward higher ground together. I walked through waist-deep water in the darkness, and I didn't look back even once because there was nothing behind me worth saving anymore. The flood gave me the perfect cover to vanish completely, and I took it without hesitation. I let the water carry away my old life and my identity, and everything I had been for 63 years. If my sons wanted to inherit my farm, then they could have it because I would rather die alone in a ditch than live one more day knowing my own children celebrated the idea of my death. I walked for hours through that flood until I reached the main road 3 miles away. My clothes were soaked and my body was shaking from cold and exhaustion, but I felt strangely free for the first time in years. A truck driver found me on the side of the road at dawn and asked if I needed help getting back to my family. I told him I had no family anymore, and I asked him to take me as far away from this village as his truck would go. He looked at me strange, but he didn't ask questions, and he drove me to a town 3 hours south where nobody knew my name or my face. I lived in that town for 20 years, like a man who never existed, and I had no identification and no past, and no name that anyone could trace back to the village I left behind. I took whatever work people would give to an old man with no papers and no references, and most days that meant cleaning animal stalls or hauling trash or fixing broken fences for $5 and a hot meal. I slept in barns when farmers felt generous enough to let me, and I slept in church basements when the weather got too cold, and sometimes I just slept under bridges when there was nowhere else to go. People looked at me like I was invisible because that's what happens when you become homeless and old and nobody knows your story or cares to ask. I never told anyone my real name or where I came from because I didn't want to risk someone recognizing me and sending word back to my sons. I became just another nameless old man that society forgot about, and I accepted that role because it was better than living with people who wished I was dead. Some nights I would sit outside a small restaurant and watch families eating together through the window, and I would wonder if my sons ever thought about me, or if they just moved on the second they declared me dead. I imagined them selling my farm and splitting the money and buying nice cars and living in cities far away from the land I broke my back to give them. I found out later through an old neighbor who moved to the same town and didn't recognize me that my sons held a funeral exactly 1 week after the flood. They buried an empty coffin and they cried in front of the whole village, and everyone said what devoted sons they were to grieve so deeply for their father. That same neighbor told me my sons sold the entire farm 6 months later for a good price, and they split everything 4 ways just like they planned. She said they moved away quickly, and nobody heard from them much after that because they were too busy enjoying their new lives to remember the village where they grew up. I worked as a stable hand for a man who paid me in food and a corner of his barn to sleep in, and he never asked my name because he didn't care as long as I showed up and did the work. I spent my days shoveling manure and feeding horses, and my nights lying awake thinking about the 4 sons I raised and how completely I had failed as a father. 20 years passed like that, and I became an old ghost who existed but didn't really live, and I thought that was how my story would end. I thought I would die quietly in some barn or under some bridge, and nobody would even know to bury me, but then last month everything changed when I collapsed. During those 20 years living as a ghost, I kept hearing stories about my sons through people who passed through town from my old village, and every story felt like another knife in my heart. The old neighbor woman who didn't recognize me would sit at the church soup kitchen and talk about how my sons had become so successful and wealthy after their poor father died in that terrible flood. She told everyone how they sold the farm for nearly $500,000 because land prices had gone up and developers wanted to build houses where my fields used to be. She said my eldest son bought a big house in the city and started some kind of business and drove an expensive car and had a wife who wore fancy clothes to church on Sundays. My second son apparently moved even farther away and got a job with some company that paid him more money in 1 year than I had made in my entire lifetime of farming. My third son opened a restaurant in another state and the neighbors said it was very successful and he never came back to visit the village even once. The youngest one, who I had loved the most because he reminded me of myself when I was young, bought a sports car with his share of the inheritance and crashed it within 6 months. The neighbor laughed when she told that story like it was funny, but all I could think about was how he had taken the money from 40 years of my suffering and wasted it on something stupid. Everything I built with my own bleeding hands for 4 decades got auctioned off and divided up and spent on cars and houses and businesses, and none of them kept even one small piece of the farm to remember me by. They didn't keep the land or the house or even a single tree I planted, and that told me everything I needed to know about how little I meant to them. The neighbor said they never came back for holidays or anniversaries or to visit my grave, and the village people eventually stopped talking about them because there was nothing new to say. My sons had taken their money and erased every connection to the place where I raised them and the father who sacrificed everything for them. I heard all these stories while scrubbing floors and shoveling horse manure and sleeping in corners of barns, and every word made me feel more and more like I had made the right choice to disappear. They didn't mourn me for even a year before they celebrated their inheritance and forgot I existed. Some nights I would think about going back and revealing myself and confronting them about what they did. But then I would remember that night before the flood when I heard them wishing for my death. I realized they got exactly what they wanted when I vanished, and going back would only give them the burden they were so desperate to get rid of. So I stayed gone, and I let them think the flood took me, and I lived my ghost life in poverty while they lived their comfortable lives on the foundation of my sacrifice. That was my choice, and I lived with it for 20 years until my body finally gave out. Last month I was carrying bags of feed at the stable where I worked, and suddenly I couldn't breathe and my chest felt like someone was crushing it with their hands. I collapsed right there in the dirt, and the stable owner found me unconscious and called an ambulance because he thought I was dying right in front of him. They took me to a free clinic that treated homeless people and poor workers who had no insurance or money to pay for real hospitals. I woke up 3 days later with tubes in my arms and machines beeping around me, and a young doctor standing over my bed looking at me with a strange expression on his face. He told me I had pneumonia very badly, and my lungs were filling with fluid, and I was lucky to be alive because another day without treatment would have killed me. Then he said something that made my blood run cold, and he said they found an old scar on my left arm that matched a description in a missing persons report from 20 years ago. I tried to tell him he was wrong and that he had me confused with someone else, but my voice was too weak and he wasn't listening anyway. He said they ran DNA tests while I was unconscious because the scar was very distinctive and it matched perfectly with samples taken from my old house after the flood. The doctor told me my family had been notified that I was alive and they were driving here right now to see me. I started panicking, and I tried to pull the tubes out of my arms because I didn't want to see them and I didn't want them to find me after all these years. The nurses held me down and gave me something to calm me, and they told me I should be happy that my family was coming because most homeless old men die alone with nobody to claim their bodies. They didn't understand that being alone was exactly what I wanted, and that seeing my sons again was worse than dying. I had 2 days to think about what I would say to them before they arrived, and I went through every possible conversation in my head. Part of me wanted to pretend I had amnesia and didn't remember anything, so they would just leave me alone, but I knew that wouldn't work because the DNA test proved who I was. Another part of me wanted to scream at them and tell them exactly what I heard that night before the flood and how I knew they wanted me dead. But mostly, I just felt tired and old, and I realized I had been carrying this pain for 20 years, and maybe it was time to finally let it out. The doctor said my sons had been crying on the phone when they got the news, and they couldn't believe I was alive. He said they sounded like loving sons who had mourned their father for 2 decades, and I almost laughed at how good they were at pretending even after all this time. On the 3rd day after I woke up, I heard loud voices coming down the hospital hallway, and I knew immediately it was them, even though I hadn't heard their voices in 20 years. The door burst open, and all 4 of my sons rushed into that small clinic room like they were in some kind of movie, and they were crying and shouting and reaching for me with their hands. My eldest son, who was now in his 50s, grabbed my hand so hard it hurt, and he was sobbing like a child and saying, "Father, Father, we thought you were dead, and we mourned you for 20 years, and thank God you're alive." My second son fell to his knees beside the bed and put his face in the blankets, and his whole body was shaking like he was devastated, and he kept saying, I'm sorry, over and over again. But I didn't know what he was apologizing for yet. The third son stood at the foot of my bed with tears running down his fat face, and he looked so much older and heavier than I remembered, and he was saying, "This is a miracle, and we prayed for this day, and God has answered our prayers." The youngest one, who I used to love the most, was leaning against the wall crying quietly, and he looked at me with these big, sad eyes like he expected me to feel sorry for him. All 4 of them were dressed in expensive clothes that probably cost more than I made in a year of shoveling horse manure, and I could see gold watches on their wrists and nice shoes on their feet. They looked successful and comfortable and well-fed, and I looked at my own thin body under the hospital blanket and my rough, scarred hands, and I felt the huge distance between what they had become and what I had been reduced to. The nurses and the young doctor were standing in the doorway watching this emotional reunion, and they were smiling like it was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. They had no idea what was really happening here, and they thought they were witnessing a family miracle when actually they were watching 4 liars perform for an audience. My eldest son wouldn't let go of my hand, and he kept saying, "We thought the flood took you, and we searched for weeks and we never gave up hope, but eventually we had to accept you were gone." He was lying so smoothly and so convincingly that I almost believed him myself, except I knew the truth about what happened and why I really left. My second son lifted his face from the blankets and said, "We held a beautiful funeral for you, Father, and the whole village came and everyone said such wonderful things about you and how much you meant to the community." I wanted to laugh at that because I knew they buried an empty box and cried fake tears and then sold my farm 6 months later, like I never existed. The third son came around to the side of the bed and put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "We never stopped loving you, and we talked about you all the time, and we told our children stories about their grandfather who died a hero trying to save others in the flood." That was a new lie I hadn't heard before, and it made me sick to think they had turned my disappearance into some kind of heroic story. The youngest son finally came closer, and he sat on the edge of my bed carefully, and he said very quietly, "I missed you every single day, Father, and there wasn't a moment when I didn't wish you were still with us." His voice was shaking, and he looked sincere, but I remembered what he said that night about wishing I would hurry up and die, and I felt nothing but disgust. They all kept talking over each other and asking me questions about where I had been and what happened to me and why I never came home, and they were performing this whole show of concern and love. The doctor was explaining that I probably had amnesia from trauma, and that's why I never returned, but I knew he was wrong, and soon they would know he was wrong too. I let them cry and talk and perform for about 10 minutes while I just stared at the ceiling and said nothing. They started to get uncomfortable with my silence, and they looked at each other with confused expressions like they couldn't understand why I wasn't crying and hugging them back. That's when I decided it was time to tell them the truth. I pulled my hand away from my eldest son's grip very slowly and deliberately, and the room got quiet because they could all sense something was wrong with the way I was looking at them. I took a deep breath that hurt my damaged lungs, and I said in a clear voice that was stronger than it had been in days that I didn't die in the flood, and I didn't have amnesia, and I didn't get lost or confused or injured. I told them I left on purpose that night because I heard every single word they said when they were sitting in my kitchen planning what they would do with my farm after I died. My eldest son's face went completely white, like all the blood had drained out of it, and he took a step backward and said, "What are you talking about, Father? You must be confused." But I wasn't confused, and I kept talking. And I told them I was standing outside the window that night coming back from checking on the sick cow, and I heard them discussing how I was a burden and how my death would solve all their problems. I said I heard my second son laugh about how I could barely work anymore and ate too much food for someone who contributed so little. My third son made a choking sound and grabbed onto the bed rail like he needed it to hold himself up. I told them I heard my youngest son say he was tired of pretending to care and he wished I would just hurry up and die so they could get their inheritance and move on with their lives. The youngest son started shaking his head back and forth, saying, "No, that's not true. You misunderstood. We never said those things." But I didn't misunderstand anything, and I told him I stood outside that window for 30 minutes listening to all four of them talk about me like I was already rotting in the ground. I said I heard them planning which equipment they would sell first and calculating how much the land was worth and discussing who would get the house. I told them nobody said anything about keeping the farm or honoring my memory or teaching their children the skills I taught them, and they just wanted me gone so they could cash out. My second son actually fell into a chair in the corner and put his head in his hands, and the doctor looked very uncomfortable, like he was starting to realize this wasn't the happy reunion he thought it was. The nurses had stopped smiling, and one of them quietly left the room. I told my sons that I walked away into that flood on purpose, because if they wanted me dead so badly, then I would give them exactly what they wished for. I said I let the water erase me, and I disappeared into another town, and I lived like a ghost for 20 years, while they sold everything I built and spent the money and forgot I existed. My eldest son tried to interrupt and say we can explain. "Father, please let us explain," but I held up my hand and told him to shut his mouth because I wasn't finished talking yet. I said I heard stories over the years about how successful they all became with their inheritance money and how they bought houses and cars and businesses with the farm I broke my back to build for them. I told them they sold every single piece of that property within 6 months, and none of them kept even one tree or one corner of land to remember me by. I said they never came back to visit my grave on holidays or anniversaries, and the village people eventually stopped talking about them because they vanished just like I did, except they vanished with my money. The third son made a weird gasping sound and his face turned red, and then he stumbled backward and his eyes rolled up in his head and he collapsed onto the floor. The youngest son screamed and dropped to his knees beside him, and the doctor rushed over to check if he was breathing. My eldest son was just standing there frozen with his mouth open, staring at me like he was seeing a ghost, and I guess in a way he was. My second son was still sitting in the chair with his head in his hands, and his whole body was shaking, but not from crying this time, but from shame. I said the final thing I needed to say, and I told them I didn't come back for 20 years because being homeless and sleeping in barns and shoveling horse manure for food was better than living one more day with sons who celebrated the idea of my death. I said they got exactly what they wanted when I disappeared, and now they could leave because I had nothing left to say to them. The third son woke up on the floor, confused and crying, and the doctor was trying to check his blood pressure. My second son finally looked up at me with a destroyed expression on his face and whispered, "Please forgive us. We were young and stupid and we didn't mean it." But I told him they meant every word, and I knew because I heard the excitement in their voices when they talked about splitting my inheritance. My eldest son finally found his voice again, and he started talking very fast, saying, "We were wrong, Father. We were terrible and selfish, and we have regretted it every day since you died. But you have to understand, we were under so much pressure back then." I cut him off and told him not to make excuses because I didn't want to hear about their pressure or their stress or whatever justification they invented to make themselves feel better about wishing their own father dead. I told them I lived for 20 years with nothing while they lived with everything, and that was the choice I made because I would rather have nothing than accept love from people who only pretended to care. My second son stood up from the chair and came toward the bed with his hands out like he was begging, and he said, "We did love you, Father. We were just angry and frustrated, and we said terrible things, but we didn't really mean we wanted you to die." But I knew they meant it because people don't sit around a kitchen table for 30 minutes planning how to divide up inheritance money if they don't really want the person dead. I told him I heard the relief in their voices when they talked about life after I was gone, and that kind of relief doesn't come from people who actually love you. The third son was sitting on the floor now, with his back against the wall looking completely broken, and he said in a shaking voice that they held a funeral, and they cried real tears, and they told everyone what a good father I was. I laughed at that, and it hurt my chest. But I laughed anyway, because the idea of them crying real tears was the funniest thing I had heard in 20 years. I told them they cried because that's what people do at funerals when everyone is watching, but 6 months later they sold my farm and spent the money and moved away and never looked back. I said real grief doesn't disappear in 6 months and real love doesn't get erased by inheritance money. My youngest son was still kneeling on the floor, and he looked up at me with tears and snot running down his face, and he said, "I was just a kid back then, Father. I was only 22 years old, and I didn't understand what I was saying." I told him 22 was old enough to know that wishing your father dead was evil, and age wasn't an excuse for that kind of cruelty. I said I worked myself into an old man by 50 so they could have comfortable lives, and the only thing I ever asked for in return was basic respect and love. I told them they couldn't even give me that much, and instead they sat in my own kitchen, eating food I paid for, and wished I would hurry up and die. My sons stayed in that hospital room for another 2 hours, begging me to forgive them and saying they would do anything to make things right, but I had nothing left to give them because they had already taken everything 20 years ago. My eldest son kept saying, "We can buy you a house, Father, and take care of you, and make sure you never have to work again." But he didn't understand that I didn't want a house bought with money from my own stolen farm. My second son promised he would quit his job and move back to take care of me personally, and he said he would spend every day trying to earn back my love and trust. I told him he couldn't earn back something that died 20 years ago when I heard him laugh about me being a burden, and I said love doesn't come back from that kind of death. The third son said they could buy back the farmland from the developers and rebuild everything exactly how it was before, and we could all live there together as a family. I almost felt sorry for him, because he actually thought you could buy back the past and erase 20 years of suffering with a real estate transaction. My youngest son didn't make any big promises because I think he understood better than the others that there was no fixing what they had broken. He just sat on the floor next to my bed and cried quietly, and every few minutes he would say, "I'm sorry, Father," and I would say nothing back, because sorry was just a word, and words were what got us into this mess in the first place. The doctor finally told them they needed to leave because I needed rest, and my heart rate was getting too high from all the stress. My sons didn't want to go, and they argued with the doctor saying they just found their father after 20 years, and they weren't ready to leave yet. But I told the doctor to make them leave because I was tired of looking at their faces and tired of hearing their excuses and promises. I said I had lived without them for 20 years, and I could keep living without them for however much time I had left. My eldest son wrote down his phone number on a piece of paper and put it on the table next to my bed, and he said, "Please call us, Father, anytime, day or night, and we will come immediately." I didn't even look at the paper, and after they left, I asked the nurse to throw it away. They came back the next day, and the day after that, but I told the nurses not to let them in my room. I could hear them in the hallway arguing with the staff and saying they had a right to see their father, but I had rights too, and I had the right to refuse visitors. On the fourth day, the doctor came to tell me I was recovered enough to be discharged, but I had nowhere to go. He suggested I contact my sons because they had left their information and offered to take me home with them, but I told him I would rather go to a homeless shelter than spend one night under their roofs. The doctor looked at me with this sad expression and said he didn't understand why I was being so stubborn when I had 4 sons willing to help me. I told him he couldn't understand because he didn't hear what I heard that night, and he didn't live 20 years as punishment for the crime of being inconvenient to his own children. A social worker came to process my discharge, and she found me a bed at a shelter on the other side of town. My sons were waiting in the lobby when I was wheeled out, and they tried to stop me and convince me to come home with them, but I kept my eyes straight ahead and didn't acknowledge they existed. I heard my youngest son crying behind me as they pushed my wheelchair toward the exit, and part of me felt something twist in my chest, but I pushed it down. I heard my eldest son yelling that this was crazy and I was being unreasonable, and they were my family, but I didn't turn around. The shelter wasn't much different from the barns and church basements I had lived in for 20 years. I had a small bed in a room with 5 other old men, and we shared one bathroom and ate meals in a cafeteria that smelled like bleach and old food. My sons found out where I was staying within a week, and they showed up trying to take me out of there. The shelter staff had to call the police because my second son tried to physically carry me out, saying, "No father of mine is living in a place like this." I told the police I was there by choice, and I didn't want my sons contacting me anymore. They made my sons leave and helped me file a restraining order that said they had to stay at least 500 feet away from me. I still live in that shelter now, and it has been 8 months since they found me in the hospital. My sons call the shelter phone sometimes and leave messages begging me to talk to them, but I never call back because I have nothing to say. Sometimes I see them sitting in cars across the street watching the shelter from a distance because the restraining order won't let them come closer. They sit there for hours, like they're keeping watch over me, but it's 20 years too late for that kind of devotion. The other men in the shelter ask me why I won't let my rich sons help me, and I tell them it's complicated, but the truth is, it's not complicated at all. I heard what they said that night, and I know what they really think of me, and no amount of guilt money will ever erase those words. My youngest son tried to sneak into the shelter last month by volunteering to serve dinner, and he got close enough to whisper that he was sorry before the staff recognized him and made him leave. I looked right through him like he was invisible because that's what he did to me for 20 years. I spend my days doing small jobs around the shelter to earn my keep, and my nights lying in my small bed thinking about the farm I built and the sons I raised and how completely everything fell apart. Some of the other old men have children who visit and bring them things, and I watch from a distance and feel nothing. The social worker keeps telling me I should reconcile with my family before it's too late. But she doesn't understand that it was already too late 20 years ago when I stood outside that window. She thinks forgiveness is something you owe people, but I think forgiveness is something people have to earn, and my sons will never earn it. They found me alive after 20 years, and I told them the truth about why I left, and now they have to live with that knowledge for the rest of their lives. I would rather die alone in this shelter than accept their guilt offerings because at least here I have my dignity and my truth, and nobody can take those away from me.